Dr. Sonja Brookins Santelises from the city of Baltimore, Maryland. How many folks from Maryland in the room? I thought a few might have showed up. So we're so happy that you're here and you are being represented by one of the great leaders in the field. She has spent her education career focused on ensuring high quality teaching and learning for all students so that all can excel. Dr. Santelises previously served as Vice President for K-12 Policy and Practice at the Education Trust, was an assistant superintendent for a network of 23 pilot schools in Boston, and has a track record of successfully meeting students' needs and improving achievement for low-income students. And she was also the executive director of the New York City Algebra Project and the National School Reform Effort. She has lectured on urban education at Harvard University and has coached superintendents, trained school leaders, and supported leaders across 5 large urban districts. Throughout her career, she has served as an inspiration. She has been steadfast in her beliefs that excellence in urban education is achievable at scale. And today, she is here to share her insights on leadership for learning and excellence for every child. Please welcome Sonja Brookins Santelises.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's fabulous to be here, and I actually consider this a privilege, number one, because whenever I have the opportunity to address fellow educators, fellow laborers in the work, that in and of itself is always an honor. Second, I will say I know that some of my folks from Baltimore City are here, but also just based on tweets and texts and emails I've received, there are a lot of educators here who, quite frankly, I would say I could just as easily be sitting in the seat and listening to them. And so with that, I kind of humbly come before you today really with a district leader voice, but more importantly, a practitioner voice to share some of the work that's going on in Baltimore City. That's the work that I know right now. That's the work that I think actually has the most meaning for those of you who are truly working in a way that you want to be equity warriors on behalf of all young people, achieving their potential and learning at high levels. And so part of really what I'm going to do is just take some time to share with you a little bit about our journey in Baltimore. That journey began about 3.5 years ago now, and one of the things that we sought to do first was to ground our work every day in schools in the context of our city and in the context of, again, this great big word called equity that now, you know how we are as educators, we get our term, this is the flavor of the month, right? Whether it's small group instruction or whether it's critical thinking. By the way, my husband said to me the other night, how come you guys don't use the critical thinking thing again? I thought I was hip, and now that seems to have gone out of style. And I was like, just wait about 2 months and it'll circle back. Don't worry about it. But one of the things that we've really tried to do is ground our work, again, in both the history, the context, and the young people that we're serving. So where we started was really in the history of Baltimore. Now, Baltimore, and I can say this after having lived 10 years there, I am raising, my husband and I are raising our 3 daughters there. Baltimore is truly a city of greats, right? So we talk about Francis Scott Key and the penning of the Star-Spangled Banner, right, in the War of 1812. We talk about our amazing crab cakes, and I have to admit, even as a Patriots fan, I have to root every time the Ravens do well as well, right? So there's a lot that is fantastic about Baltimore, a lot of firsts. Well, another first that isn't so great, that I think we're not so proud of, is Baltimore taught the rest of the nation how to redline. Now, for those of you who don't know what redlining is or want a quick refresher, you'll see this map, this redlining map, and this is from 1937. Actual map of Baltimore City. And what redlining basically is the legal restriction of movement of people of particular ethnic groups, and in Baltimore it also included Jewish Americans as well for a time, but the legalized restriction based on housing covenants of people groups. And so what you see here in Baltimore City in the red sections were areas where only blacks could either buy or purchase housing. As you moved out, in the orange, you see some transition areas, and I would say in the light green and green, still are some of the more deliberately created, particularly the dark green, particularly deliberately created communities for the more wealthy within Baltimore City. That is 1937. And so when I showed this at first, you know, some of the principals in our leadership academy at the time, some of our teacher leaders were like, okay, well, that's a really interesting history. Sonja, how does that apply? Well, take a look at a current map of Baltimore City. Now, what's interesting about Baltimore City now is that those red areas, the map you now see, is what we call our Community Conditions Index that Baltimore City Public Schools comprised as a way of monitoring how our schools were doing and how we were serving schools in particular sections of the city based on the historical investment or disinvestment in those communities. One of the things that you'll note, if you look at the section that has the black shaded boxes, do you see that? In that section, you guys have to do some call and response with me. My black church tradition, y'all got to give me a little bit more than this. Yes, I lectured at Harvard, and I know how to do the as well, but it's nice to kind of get a balance every once in a while. Okay, so work with me a little bit. So the black shaded section is that original redlining from 1937. We superimposed this map, our community conditions map, and what we saw, what you will see, is what we saw, that very much the same areas that in 1937, just about 80 years ago, right, were deliberately constructed for disinvestment, for the restriction of movement of certain people groups, is bearing out in the education of our young people today. So it is not separate. It is not a past that would be convenient to forget. We'd all like to be able to forget it, but there's one small catch. It's actually impacting our kids now. So we can't really forget it. Now, Baltimore City educators, I know none of you all would do this, but in Baltimore City, when we first showed this map, right, Janice Lane was there, our head of teaching and learning, and she'll tell you, she probably remembers, what educators did is what we educators normally do. They were like, this is horrible. This is crazy. Those bad, bad housing people. Those bad, bad bankers. Look what they did to our kids and our neighborhoods. And it was very easy to watch this mapping when everything was about what other agencies and other people had done. What became even more interesting was when we began digging deeply in our practice, we began to understand that we had our own version of redlining in education, about which children get what, which neighborhood schools get which opportunities. And so to give you an edited version, my good friends at Unbound Ed came up with a video that helps so that you guys now get the annotated version and the edited version. And so I invite you to just very briefly see how the continuation of this act, this history of redlining, plays out in schools and in classrooms every day. Redlining, right? Housing, neighborhoods where no investment would go are outlined in red. And we have equivalents of redlining in education. Our redlining just looks a little different. Our redlining is certain kids only get certain curriculum, right? Our redlining is who gets what assignment and who gets another. Who's in what reading group? When do you shift groups? When does someone get to move? When does somebody stay? that is also part of that historical context. So, when we think about educational redlining, I would submit that it's easy for me as a leader in Baltimore, as a resident of Baltimore, to put my city and my schools under the radar. But I would argue that in many of the cities and communities that you represent, there's some variation of this. Because it was something that we were successful, unfortunately, in exporting to every corner of the nation. So when we think about educational redlining, I would also say, and I don't know how many folks have seen the opportunity myth that TNTP put out? Okay, great. If you haven't, I encourage it. I don't get a commission. They don't give me anything. But I would encourage that you take a look at the opportunity myth. Because another version of this redlining, they did a deep analysis of thousands of classroom assignments. And one of the things that TNTP found in their analysis is that classrooms with mostly white students were 1.5 times more likely to get grade-appropriate assignments, 3.6 times more likely to get high-quality lessons, and 1.2 more likely to get more engaging experiences than classrooms with mostly children of color. And then you can see the corresponding data on the right. That, my friends, is another version of educational redlining. Who gets access? Where? What content? What are we asking certain kids to do that we're not asking others? One of the other things that the report found was that if you were to take, on average, the same trajectory, right, for students who begin, and if you look at the bottom graph, students who begin substantially behind in grade level, that your exposure to high-quality lessons, high-quality assignments, makes you more or less likely to actually close the achievement gap. When I showed my staff that bottom graph, there was silence around the table. Because what that bottom graph indicates is that if we can figure out a way to break down those walls, the achievement gap is actually able to be closed. It is not inevitable. It is baked into the system. And unless we acknowledge it, and what we in Baltimore City have done is said, let's acknowledge it. Let's not act like it's the elephant in the room that everybody walks around and throws a peanut every once in a while when it starts to talk in a meeting. But we're actually going to name it, and we're going to call it out, and we're going to actually work to shift that. Another piece that's interesting about the TNTP work, because it occurred at a larger scale, is it also matched some of my own research that I was fortunate enough to do while I was Vice President of Education Trust, where we also did an analysis of assignments. And we had also a number of qualitative components. And this is one of my favorite quotes that was part of the paper that we published, that I jointly published with a colleague of mine, Joan Dabrowski, around what the student reaction is. Because it's one thing to think that all this shifting, that all these practices are somehow silent ghosts moving throughout schools and classrooms. But what I love about this quote is it signals that young people actually know what's going on around them. They know when they are asked to read a 6th grade level text, like the Hunger Games in high school, and when kids across the hall in some places and across the city in the others are being asked to read the Odyssey. And my favorite line in this quote was, "We needed to know the same exact things, but while they were starting to read the Odyssey, we were reading the Hunger Games." And I love this little diplomatic thought. There's nothing wrong with the Hunger Games. I love the Hunger Games. I read it when I was 12. It just struck me as unfair. So when we talk about this big word equity, when we talk about making changes, the question we had to ask ourselves is, are we willing to get down into the nitty-gritty of the daily grind of how we do our work? Because this doesn't happen based on one decision. This doesn't happen just because of covenants put in place in 1937. It happens every single day in all of our classrooms. So the next thing we did was we said, well, okay, if we're redlining, what about the actual access to content and the actual access to being able to be exposed to the kind of knowledge we know young people need? So we partnered with Johns Hopkins University, and we did an audit of our ELA curriculum. And we did that as a way of checking for ourselves, where were we? We were already beginning to make shifts with regard to our foundational literacy work, with far more explicit phonics instruction, far more emphasis on phonological awareness. But we also know this, that for young people who are locked out, who have been in those red boxes, there's certain information that doesn't always reach you. And so we asked ourselves, through Hopkins's work, how are we doing on this content piece, on this exposure piece? And this is one map, really quickly, that shows you one of the most powerful pieces we found. And what you'll see here, and I know that there were some workshops on this work that we did. It was part of how we selected curriculum. But the main takeaway from this is, when we were deliberate, what we thought we were doing, we were not doing. And it's not just because we were Baltimore City. It was because we actually stepped out and made a decision to hold a mirror up to our practice that we thought was equitable practice, but when we looked, it wasn't. And so what we found was, what you'll see is in this particular cut right now on the left, my leftmost side, maybe your rightmost side, the American history and geography topics. And we cut those across grades K through 5. And so the darker colors are the exposure of, like, say, 5 to 7 texts or 8 texts. The lighter the blue, the less exposure. The white space is it was not covered in that year in that topic area. So what that means is you could be exposed to North American geography in kindergarten and never see it again in your career in elementary school. It means that westward expansion, I think it's westward expansion, you had to wait all the way to grade 5, and ironically, the Civil War, forget it, you're not getting any of that until middle. So what that does when we're talking about young people who, right, because we have real conversations in Baltimore, when you have parents that are working 2 or 3 jobs, right? When you have parents who are barely navigating a system with a new language, do you really believe they have time to check all this? And true confessions, because my children, right, went to elementary school in city schools, I take my kids to art museums and history museums. So some of that will be made up just by virtue of they unfortunately have a Tiger Mama CEO as a mother. But even for me, my kids will miss some of that if we are not deliberate in making sure that access means access for all. So before we go there, oh, thank you. So, one of the things that happened, some of you have heard about that work. We partnered again. There are folks here in other districts who I have great respect for, went on a similar journey. And so we get our new curriculum, and we're so excited. We've got knowledge-rich, research-based, New curriculum, yes, this is going to change everything. And because you are sitting here at Learning Forward, so I know that you understand what I'm about to say, guess what? People actually still have to go back and teach and lead around a new set of competencies and a new set of content. And so we were incredibly excited about what we found, but let me tell you some of what we're seeing, even in our adoption of rigorous, standards-aligned, content-rich curriculum that gets to this point of why the work you all are doing at this conference and back in your schools is so vital. Because curriculum alone is a solid and needed first step. But alone, it is insufficient in actually disrupting that trajectory of redlining that I pointed to. And hint, hint, Baltimore is not the only district that I've ever worked in. And I gotta tell you, there's some of it going on in other places too. Now, I just whispered that one. So if you want to speed past that in the dubbing of the tape, you can. So what did we find? So as we look, and I'm going to give you an example. So this is from our Eureka math curriculum, grade 8, standard around solving linear equations with rational numbers and coefficients, right? So this is a little, for those of you in the back, they tell me you have a screen. The details aren't necessarily important. You can go back and get the slides for yourself. I'm going to show you how 2 classrooms, this is frankly fairly standard. This is not the most in-depth, heavily mathematically complex task that young people were given. Same task, 2 classrooms. It's important for you to know, and I got into a wonderful back and forth with some colleagues at Research Ed about this, which I'll tell you about later. But for me, it highlights why we have to have the conversation and why attending to adult learning is crucial to any work we say that we are doing on behalf of increasing equity and increasing outcomes for all young people. Great. So, classroom 1, same task, write and solve the following linear equations. Ophelia has a certain amount of money. If she spends $12, then she has 1/5 of the original amount left. How much money did Ophelia have originally? It's important for you to know that this was not the first lesson, and Janice will cue me if I'm wrong on this. This was not the first lesson. Kids had spent some time in this previously, so this was not new material, right? Classroom 1, the teacher asks, what is the goal when solving an equation? Students respond, to have the x equal to some constant. Teacher's second question, in this problem, what is one possible first step? Now keep in mind, again, this is review and that's important. One student says, subtract 1/5 x from both sides using the subtraction property of equality. And there's the student work that accompanies it. You see what the student produced, what the student shared. Teacher, can another student give another possible first step? Student, subtract x from both sides using the subtraction property of equality. This student would have been me in 8th grade. Get the heck rid of that x. Right? I want it gone. And we get to x equals 15. Teacher, can another student give another possible first step? Student, we could multiply each term by the reciprocal of 1/5 to eliminate the fraction. This is what one of my daughters would have done because she freezes when she hits fractions, so she's like, give me whatever I can do to get rid of the doggone fraction. 3 approaches. Student work to match all 3. Review, young people interacting with their knowledge of what they already have. Classroom 2. Students copy what was on the board first. Teacher, action. Now that you have written the correct equation, x minus 12 equals 1/5 x, remember our first step to solve is to get rid of any fractions. If you want to get rid of a fractional coefficient, what do? The whole class, multiply everything by the denominator. Teacher, what is the denominator of 1/5? Whole class, 5. Teacher, remember to multiply each term by 5. Whole class. Now use the properties of equalities to isolate the variable. Now, part of what I want to point out in this, and it's lovely when you use actual, and I'm sure I'm going to get like 15 emails within 5 minutes, right? But I think what's important to ask ourselves is if young people are in the same place in the curriculum, right? So like for an introductory lesson for kids that are struggling, if you want to review, there's nothing wrong. So I'm not bashing the second classroom. So hear me. But the question that I have is if there was this big of a difference in the perceived independent readiness of young people, why was there such a difference in the approach? And why, so far along in this material, is the teacher still doing heavy explicit guided teach? Now, there could be an amazingly valid reason for that. But I will tell you, one of the things that we notice is in classrooms with overwhelmingly large numbers of children of color, the release that you saw in that first lesson does not occur. They never let go. They are always tethered. They never get to press and see. Now again, nothing wrong with the second. I've got a kid who struggles with math, and I would want her to get that lesson too a good 5 or 6 times for her to internalize. But if she leaves the same place in the lesson after the same amount of time or even more time and cannot go back and understand all the other ways to get that answer, I would argue to you as both mother, former teacher, and CEO of a large urban school district that that could be, if not delved into, educational redlining. But the more important question, so I want principals, my superintendents, colleagues, the goal of this is not to then go and beat up the teacher in classroom 2. So when I go into classrooms and see 2 different, my first question, and Janice knows this because she's been on learning walks with me, is tell me what you were thinking. Why did you make the shift that you made? Did you know what your colleague did next door? And you all know, because you're sitting at a Learning Forward conference, that most teachers don't have that opportunity. So at most, they get somebody with a clipboard, because we heard in my district, Dr. S came in and said she saw da-da-da-da. They beat people up. And the exchange that's necessary to actually come into the learning is never reached. So when I did this, when I used this sample in Florida, the Florida Teacher of the Year, I don't know, she might be here today. The Florida Teacher of the Year at the time was there. And when I walked through what a conversation with a group of teachers could look like around just this, you know what she said to me? She said, if somebody actually came and approached this problem solving, this analysis, the way you just described, she said, I actually wouldn't have any issue with people coming in my classroom. She said, the problem is people want a quick hit. They want to go in with a check sheet, only watch you for 5 minutes, twice a year, and then send down an edict about the quality of your teaching. Yeah, it got quiet now, didn't it? So part of this thing about educational redlining is we have to ask ourselves what we are asking ourselves in Baltimore City, which is why some of the people from Baltimore City who are here now will not own that they work for me, because they're like, she just is always on me. It's this constant question. What is actually taking place What are teachers experiencing, understanding around the curriculum? And then what is the result that we are seeing with young people on a day-to-day? And how can we not be afraid to talk about the differentiation that we see? Because therein lies the rub. Another quick example for my elementary school folks. Oh, so this was some of the commentary. So, Wit and Wisdom, second grade lesson. We are giddy. Yay, we love it. Life is good. We think, finally, teachers are happy. We don't have 15 different curricula going all across the city. We thought life was good, but alas, the work had just begun. So, we have a courageous first-year, second grade teacher with Wit and Wisdom. Again, I didn't pick the complex lessons, folks. I didn't pick the most rigorous. I picked the kind of everyday, because what I have learned is that the little things we do every single day accumulate into a trajectory that is either growth, stagnation, or loss for young people. It's not a one-up. It's not today I had a big, great lesson, and little Sonja Santelises, who was a knucklehead over in the corner, today had a good day. It is about what happens with me over the course of my career over a band of teachers across schools and across classrooms. So, first-year teacher, who was, God bless her, open enough to share her work. Wit and Wisdom lesson, I'll go through really quickly. Very simple. It was just matching key details with major events in the story. What you'll see is that here was a major, this was a westward expansion story. Am I right, Janice? Westward expansion? Westward expansion story out of the unit. Very simple. You see the main events, and then you see key details. It was designed to be a quick refresher of the read. It was designed for kids to be able to take the key details, cut them, and match them to the main events. That's all. First thing the teacher does is create her own planner. Now, it wasn't designed for another planner, and I'm not against teacher innovation and making adjustments. But what I want to point out about the organizer shows up in the teacher-student actions. The teacher reads the text aloud to the students, and it was not their first read. Correct, Janice? It wasn't the first read. So keep in mind, the place matters. Students, they follow along on hard copies of text in front of them, along with a blank teacher-created organizer. Teacher, what key details did Olivia record in her diary? Student recalled one or two details from text in the large group. So that's what, in large groups, students surface. Teacher models recording one of those key details given to the first major event. Students copy what the teacher wrote on her organizer. Now keep in mind, they were supposed to be cutting those details and matching them to the events. They haven't even gotten to the cutting yet. Teacher guides the students to identify the second key detail. Second key detail, and match it to one of the two remaining major events on the organizer. Student copies what the teacher wrote on her organizer. Teacher sends students off to work in pairs to find one key detail to match the remaining major event. Now, let me tell you what I see. You can talk at your little tables and talk about what you see, but I only have 12 minutes left, so I got to wrap up. A lesson that was designed to give young people independent practice with some kind of kinesthetic cutting out. I don't know why second graders like to cut out, but they do. Activity, where in pairs, they were matching for the teacher to test where they were. By the time the organizer is finished, kids have gone from 3 major events of analysis to 1. The second piece is they're now going to use this organizer to do the original assignment. So part of what you have to ask is, yes, there's a fabulously rigorous, our teachers will tell you, like the Wit and Wisdom is stretching them in ways they were never stretched before. But it doesn't matter if we still water down every experience that kids have with that curriculum. Now again, this was a first-year teacher, so she gets much grace with me. But again, the question that arises in me is, what were you thinking? And not, what were you thinking? I don't mean that kind of what you were thinking. But tell me why you felt like you needed to have this organizer. What made you feel as if your entire class, not little knucklehead Sonja, but your entire class needed a guided walkthrough of a previously read story that you literally walk them through? Now, for those of you who don't teach every day, this may seem tedious, but I am telling you, in the tedium of the day-to-day, we are excluding and redlining young people from the knowledge that they need, the experiences that they need to be successful. And unless we talk about this kind of decision and the kind of coaching that supports a teacher's reflection on the why, I don't care how much rigorous curriculum we have. We will end up in similar places, and that gap will remain as wide. Or if you're following NAEP, maybe you don't love NAEP, that's okay. But hint, hint, the racial achievement gap isn't actually increasing. It didn't go down. It expanded. So what I tell folks in Baltimore is I have good intentions. We all have good intentions. But unless we can develop a community where we can safely share what we were thinking when we made this decision, and how might that be informed or confirmed? There are sometimes I'll go in, see a teacher for 15 minutes. And when they give me the background, I'm like, okay, I hear you. But now if I come back in 2 days, are you still going to be doing the same thing? And you can't get that in our tap in, tap out kind of feedback culture that we have in far too many places. Not if you want to get down to equity questions. So when I ask, and there's a video, maybe I'll forward it to you, that I showed to our principals with one that's had supposedly wonderful practice. Kids were responding. It was on the Engage New York website. Rigorous, whole 10 yards. You know what we noticed 7 minutes in? All of the kids of color in the 2 small groups were asked to give simplistic recall answers. They were not given the same quality of feedback that their other colleagues were. And we had to ask the question. So I'm not surfacing anything to you that isn't part of the work we are doing every single day. Because if we are truly going to continue to get the equity stickers and put it on our t-shirts and whatever else is now in to do around equity, and we don't deal with this, then it is yet another t-shirt that my husband will use when he goes jogging. But it will not impact the life of kids. So one of the things that I think folks like you who are invested in adult learning can contribute greatly to this equity discussion is how we begin having the real conversations rooted in the work about who is getting what and how teachers need to be supported to be able to make these kind of connections, reflections, and adjustments. And sometimes they won't make the same adjustment. They'll say something that makes sense and we'll move on. But there will be other times where there are aha moments. And I will tell you some of my favorite are when a teacher says to me, "Oh my God, I didn't see that." Really? Is that what happened? My favorite, why didn't anybody ever tell me? And so part of the shift that we are having, and I already kind of went through that. One of the shifts we're having is how do we make sure that we are elevating, harnessing the voices of the teacher leaders who actually do get this, who actually give safe space to some of their colleagues to be able to learn in an environment where you can say, honestly, I didn't know I was doing that. I did not know that is how this was impacting. Because even though in most areas of life, and my husband would be roaring in his armchair if he heard me say this, because it's true, in a lot of areas of life, I tend towards the glass half empty crowd. I do. And you're like, why in the world are you in urban education if you're a glass half empty person? But when it comes to the work that we need to do to shift our schools into learning environments, I remain a glass half full person. I choose to believe that most people, when pointed out, will actually make the adjustment or they will find some other occupation. And I know that's sacrilege and perhaps in this room, but I think it's okay. When I was at Harvard Graduate School, there were some folks I counseled out of teaching. I know that that's horrific to think, but there were some young people I said, you're actually better suited for iBanking. I just don't think you have the lights going on in the right places to do this work. But you will be a fabulous iBanker and you will make somebody tons and tons of money. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the community in which people can find themselves and confront our role, not their role, our role in the furthering of educational redlining. And my hope is represented in some of the social media feeds. So everybody laughs at me back home because I tell them I can only master one social media thing. Don't bring me Instagram. Don't bring me Facebook. I'm old. I can only hold one. So I follow Twitter, and then they send me some of the other stuff. And so part of why I printed these is that these are some of our teachers that I follow on Twitter. Kier Butts, whose kids are represented in the orange, is our Teacher of the Year, our Baltimore City School Teacher of the Year. Katie Scotty does amazing work. She has another teacher with her, I'm blank. Oh, Rebecca McClure does great work. And what I love, and this is what I tell our team, teachers respond differently when Kier, Katie, or Rebecca talk about their work than they do when I talk about it or when my central team talks about it. When Kier talks about, and I wish I tried to find the video and I couldn't bring it, it would have been a much better ending. One of Kier's students, who is 2-3 years below grade level, reading, Kier brought him in what he considered the honors group. This was the student named it the honors group, even though. And to hear this young man, young African-American man, little boy around 12, talk about, I think he was 11 actually. When's Bud Not Buddy? What grade is Bud Not Buddy, Janice? It's 11? Okay, so he was a little younger than that, so he was 11. To hear him talk about Bud Not Buddy and relate it to the period of history that was going on. And what I love is there's a break in it where he says, and I know I wasn't at first supposed to be in the honors group. He said, but I can do this. That is why we need to do this work. Because when Kier talks about that, right, other people see and know. And so what I leave you with is that equity work has to live in the day-to-day classroom experiences and decisions that we make about who gets what, who gets asked what question, who gets what support, who is seen as being capable or not capable. And that where young people, whether they are English language learners, whether they are first-gen college goers, whether they are African American, Latino, or any other underrepresented, disproportionately marginalized group of children, are exposed to those same supports, they can perform at the same level. It is our job as adults to see that that happens. So I will leave you with thank you all for being focused on the hard work of adult learning. Thank you all for being committed to being culture changers. And thank you all for being committed to the fact that if we are going to stop educational redlining, it has to begin with us. Thank you and have a great day.
Sonja, we so appreciate your message. We will stand up against educational redlining. I will tell you that right now. And I also appreciate your message that we have to be willing to put a mirror up to our own practice. So thank you so much. As leaders and systems, as district leaders, as school leaders, we know that everything you just described happens across this country and beyond. So we need to pay attention. So thank you so much.
Thank
One
you.
more round of applause
Thank
for
you.
Dr. Santelises.